Shalom everyone, I'm Ariella and I'd like to welcome you to part 2 of the Social Justice series. If you weren't here last week and missed the first one and you enjoyed tonight, I invite you to go back to the archives on the OneShul site and pull up the archived recording. Now, if you'll notice, things look a little bit different on the website. It's because Rabbi Patrick got us this wonderful new chat room. He gave a terrific presentation last night on Rabbi Nachman, and it worked perfectly. Let's hope that that continues for tonight. If you wouldn't mind signing in, I'd certainly appreciate it. Go down to the bottom where you see that little orange square rectangle where it says OneShul chat room. Just click on that, and the directions are actually much easier than our other chat room. So, Rabbi Patrick, thank you very much, and we'll see how this does tonight. I really appreciate it. Now, before we get started tonight, I wanted to tell you that any citations I have from the Bible come from the Jewish Study Bible by the Jewish Publication Society, Oxford Press, and anything from the Talmud comes from Talmud Bavli, the Sonsino translation. So I'd like to thank you all very much for coming, and we're going to get started here. This is basically what we're going to be talking about tonight. We're going to start off with Maimonides' 8 levels of charity. And by the way, as I start every night, here goes the empirical evidence of old age, so I can actually see. Maimonides' 8 levels of charity, preservation of dignity, which was very important, brief history and causes of poverty, strategies to contend with poverty, and communal institutions. And I apologize for the phone. That was the one thing I forgot to take care of tonight. And by the way, I have to look way off to the side. I've got 2 monitors up here, and I know that that was aggravating to some people last week that I had to keep looking off to the side. So my apologies for that. There's also a little bit of a lag, and there's absolutely nothing I can do about that. I'm so happy to see all of you here tonight. Now, this first slide looks a little bit bulky. Don't worry about not being able to read it, because we're going to break them up in subsequent slides so you'll be able to see it. And the first one, you're going to be able to see separately, because there are a few things about that that I think you'd be interested in knowing. I know that I was. The first one is quite important, and that's the main kind of support, charity, if you will, tzedakah, which we discussed last week, that's recommended. 2 through 8 primarily have to do with anonymity, preservation of dignity, and spontaneity and attitude toward giving. So we're going to look, as I said, at this first one separately. There's 8 levels of charity, or 8 degrees of charity or tzedakah, however you'd like to refer to it. This first one is intended to get a person out of poverty and able to stand up on their own. Avoiding poverty and dependence is of critical importance to the Israelites at this particular time when this was written. And I think that you'll find the present or loan, making a partnership with him, finding him a job. You can see that this is not actually direct giving. Interest-free and secured loans. Now, this interest-free refers specifically to Jews giving to Jews. There isn't anything that specifies what happens if you're a Jew and giving to a non-Jew. Remember the time frame that this was written. So we are commanded to exact no interest from a Jew if we are a Jew and loaning them money. And there is also nothing that says that you can't take security for a loan. Like in this case, the quote that I decided to pull out was, "If you take your neighbor's garment in pledge, you must return it to him before the sun sets. It's his only clothing, the sole covering for his skin. In what else shall he sleep? In other words, the only stipulation is if you take something in turn to secure the loan, that it can't be something that's going to put the person at risk in any way, shape, or form. Remembering that avoiding poverty and dependence, which you can well tell by the first level, which we're still addressing, some interesting stories coming up here. You're not allowed to impoverish yourself, and this is well described in the Talmud. In other words, don't be overgenerous. And as we discussed a bit last week, when we were discussing tithing, that it's recommended that you never give more than 1/5 or 20%. There is considerable amount of debate about that, and the main point seems to be that you don't give away enough so that you make yourself dependent. And moving on to the poor, do everything possible to avoid dependence. That means taking even the most menial of jobs. Special Sabbath clothing and food. Recall that you're supposed to have a fresh change of clothes or clean clothes, and you wear something different than you would normally wear the rest of the week. So with respect to the special clothing and food, the Talmud does give you permission to forego those rather than take charity. It's better to forego the special clothing and food. We're going to, for the moment, skip over Torah students and teachers. I'll come back to that in a minute because that's where the good stories are. And we'll talk about Rabbi Huna. Rabbi Huna is very interesting. He sent his servant every Friday night to the grocery store, and the servant bought up everything that was in there, and rather than give it to the poor, he threw it away. Rabbi Huna decided that he didn't want to make the poor people dependent or expect anything from anybody. He wanted them to stand up on their own. Now, I need to tell you that there's a lot of, I won't refer to them as nasty, but there was considerable debate about this in the Talmud. By the way, if any of you have any comments, please feel free to type them in, and I will look over every now and then. Now, let's talk about some of the Torah students and teachers. There was no compensation for teaching the Torah in the time frame that we're talking about, and this is before the Mishnah. We're talking about around the First Temple period and earlier. Most of the rabbis and the teachers were poor, but there were some exceptions, and we're going to start out with the wealthier ones. Rabbi Akiva, whom I'm sure you're familiar with, came from a very poor family, but he became wealthy by marriage and subsequently got an inheritance, I believe, from his wife's father. Judah HaNazi, otherwise known as Judah the Prince, was one of his disciples. And by the time that Rabbi Akiva was finished with his teaching, he had 24,000 students. And this is the Rabbi Akiva that began gathering and organizing the halachot into topics for the Mishnah. Now, Judah the Prince, Judah HaNazi, the redactor of the Mishnah, was purportedly so rich that he was able to eat fresh vegetables all year round. It's also been said that he was born on the same day that Rabbi Akiva died. That's in a midrash. Now, the third one, probably my favorite, is Rabbi Tarfon. He was also very wealthy. He was a scholar and a priest. And what a nice guy. During a lengthy famine, he married 300 women, just so that he could feed them with the sacred food that was only permitted to be eaten by the priests and members of their family. Isn't that an interesting story? Now, even though these are three examples of the rich, most of them were, in fact, poor. Rabbi Yehuda, for example, he and his wife, between them, only had one cloak. When his wife was wearing the cloak to go shopping, if she was late getting home, Rabbi Yehuda missed synagogue services because he didn't have a cloak. Next example of a really poor person was Rabbi Nuri, who you could probably find out in the fields with the poor because he was so poor, he needed to go and gather the agricultural portions that were allotted for the poor at that time. Then we have Rabbi Hanina ben Dasa, whose wife was actually lit an empty stove on the Sabbath so that her neighbors wouldn't know that she didn't have any food. That's how poor they were. And probably my favorite story of all is the Hillel story. You know, the on one foot Hillel. He used to work half a day so that he could spend the other half of the day studying the Torah and the Talmud. And one day he couldn't find work, and he needed half of the money that he got from his half-day work for entry, if you will, into the yeshiva. And since he didn't have it, he was determined that he was going to not miss a class. So he climbed up on the roof, and where he could hear the teacher through the skylight and see what was going on. Now, I guess he must have had trouble getting down, because the next morning, there was a heavy snow that night, and the next morning, when the teacher came in, he said, "My goodness, it's very, very dark in here." And he looked up, and sure enough, there was an outline of a person up on the roof. So they sent somebody up to bring Hillel down and warmed him up in front of the fireplace. Now, this little story illustrates two things. First of all, the depth of poverty. And the other thing that was very important at that time, that no matter how poor you are still required to study Torah. Now, how did everybody get to, with the wealthy, with the charity? Rewards and threats. That was the way to get the wealthy to cough up some money. And it alternated between carrots and sticks. In Proverbs you read, "He who gives to the poor will not be in want, but he who shuts his eyes will be soundly cursed." The Talmud actually has a lot more in it regarding giving to the poor than the Tanakh does. There are a lot of citations in the Talmud that assure rewards for charitable deeds during the final judgment, and some actually commend the poor who beg. This last little story here, there was a Roman governor who was talking to our Rabbi Akiva and said, "If your God loves the poor, why does he not support them?" And Rabbi Akiva said, he replied, "So that we may be saved through them from the punishment of Gehinnom." That is in the Talmud in Baba Batria. So that's all that I have to discuss pertaining to the first one. Let's move on to 2 through 5. Number 2 is neither the donor nor the poor person know each other. Number 3, the donor knows, but the poor person doesn't know the donor. The fourth one is the donor doesn't know who he's giving to, but the donor knows who gave. And the last one is below this is one who gives to the poor person without being asked. Now, I don't have too much to say about this, except I'd like you to, at this point, mull over what you think about. Remember that we're talking about preserving dignity, which we'll come to in even more in just a moment. But what do you think about anonymity, in this, particularly in this day and age, where there usually isn't any direct giving between two people, one who gives and one who receives? When does anonymity matter to either the recipient or the donor? And when might it be a good thing to have someone who isn't anonymous? Let's see, one example I can think of is an endowment fund at a college, where if the money's dispersed, you may, if you're the endower, may not ever know who gets it, but the person who gets it know that they do. And what about maybe examples of someone who's offering a challenge? If I give X amount of money or you give X amount of money, then I will match it. But rarely these days do the two ever come face to face. Now, 6, 7, and 8, number 6 is below this is one who gives to the poor person after being asked, aka all the commercials that we see on television. And the last two really have to do with attitude. Number 7, below this is one who gives to the poor person gladly and with a smile. And if you recall, last week we were talking about tzedakah and chesed. And if you just give money, then you get 6 blessings. But if you give words of comfort, then you're going to get 11. Well, to me, this says that someone's giving tzedakah with chesed. And below this is the person who gives to the other person unwillingly. Remember that if you want to meet the mitzvah, then you have to give a certain proportion of your money. And on the other hand, there are a couple of passages in the Tanakh that say that if someone puts out their hand to you and asks you for money, that you're supposed to give it. Now, they might not want to, and I think that that would come under the heading of giving to the person unwillingly. Now, as I said in the beginning, preservation of dignity was paramount to the Israelites. And we're going to move on for a minute from the quote and go to the secret rooms in the temple. There were 2 rooms in the temple, purportedly, where the rich person went and put money into this room. And there was another room where, unobserved for either the donor or the donee, that they could go in and take the money as they needed it. Now, I couldn't find any information on how they transferred money from one room to the other, or whether they had secret passages or whatever. All I know is that in several sources, they were citing these 2 rooms that they called the secret rooms in the Second Temple. The next one having to do with coins. Rabbi Abba used to walk down the street and drop coins behind him and never turn around, and the poor people used to pick them up behind him, but they were never seen, so they felt comfortable doing that. The other thing having to do with coins is that does pertain to this quote from the Talmud up on the top here. Rabbi Ukva, and I mentioned this last week, every day he went by at a specific time and used to throw money into his neighbor's house. One day he was late and the neighbors decided to come out because he wanted to see who was doing this great thing. Well, Rabbi Ukva didn't want to be seen because he didn't want to embarrass because this was a neighbor. He ran into a recently swept fire pit that was still hot because it had just been swept. And this is a saying from the Talmud that goes along with it. Better had a man thrown himself into a fiery furnace than publicly put his neighbor to shame. With respect to sacrifices, a couple of interesting stories, and here's where I'm going to warn you ahead of time. There's a couple names here I'm probably going to not say properly. And if I could hear what you were saying instead of just typing, I'd ask you to help me out with it. King Agrippa came to the temple. He had 1,000 animals that he wanted to sacrifice. There was a poor person who came in with 2 turtle doves. The sages decided, they ruled, that the poor man was allowed to go first because the altar prefers the sacrifices of the poor. Now, the one interesting thing in addition to that is differential sacrifices, which to me in this context means sliding scale. You give what you can and you do what you can. And God's just as happy if you're poor that you're at least thinking and giving something. With the turtle doves, they burn them on the altar with their feathers on, despite the fact that the feathers apparently smelled absolutely horrendous when they were burning, because if they pulled the feathers off, the bird would look too puny next to anything else that was going on. And I thought that was really sweet that they'd put up with the smell for that. So that's my story about sacrifices. Now we move on to clothing, and I'm sure you all know what Tu B'Av is, the holiday. It's a rabbinic holiday that came to be somewhere around the Second Temple period. It celebrates the beginning of the grape harvest, and it has been likened to our Valentine's Day. This is where unmarried women went and danced in the fields. It was a matchmaking day. All the guys went out and looked at the women. And the important thing about this with respect to clothing and preserving dignity was they all wore white dresses, but they all wore borrowed white dresses, so no one could tell who was rich and who was poor. And by the way, August 10th after sunset is Tu B'Av this year. Now, with respect to burial, the one thing that I thought was going to be under burial has nothing to do with preserving dignity. But what does have to do with preserving dignity is apparently when you went to the house of the persons who were in mourning, the rich people were drinking out of white glasses and the poor people were drinking out of colored glasses. So it was decided and written in the Talmud, there's a whole section on this, that from now on, everybody who went to the mourner's home was to drink out of colored glasses so that there would be no distinction and no one would know who was poor. Also, when they brought the person into the room, the dead person into the room, if the family was wealthy, they brought the person out on a very fancy bed, all decorated, a lot of fancy clothes on and decorations hanging down the side, whereas the poor person would come out in a fairly plain bed frame and not have anything fancy on. So what they decided at this point is that everybody was going to come out on a bier that was just plain, a bier being the frame, if you will. Also, they decided that everyone needed to be dressed in plain white linen. And the other thing about the white linen is apparently they also decided that they were going to cover the person's face. Back in that day and age, I guess, they noticed that even if you were dead, and I don't know why they said this because I would think that if you were sick, you would have a different colored face anyway, but that the pallor, or what they were referring to as lividity, would look different. The wealthier person would not have as much pallor as a poor person. So they decided that the face needed to be covered. When people came to the mourner's house to offer comfort, the rich people brought their food and whatever gifts they were bringing in fancy decorated silver and gold baskets. And the poor people were bringing the food to them in a plain woven basket. And it was decided at that time that everybody needed to bring their food to the mourners in a plain basket. And I'm going to look over here for a moment at the screen. There's a comment here. Level 5 could certainly preserve the recipient's dignity, depending almost entirely on the manner of the giver. It can be a wonderful and thoughtful way to give. Boy, do I concur with that. Thank you so much for your comment, Ariella fan. I love it. I hope there's some way I can preserve this chat. That's very nice. Thank you. Let's move on and talk about poverty. By the way, one of the reasons that we're talking about poverty and hunger, etc., is because most of the people who died because they were poor, they died because they couldn't get any food. So let's look at poverty and how that moved along throughout this period that we're talking about. And we're talking from the time that Joshua engaged in the conquest of Canaan, which was about 1250. By the way, see the little thing that says that the dates are approximate. I should have put the dates are very approximate. I could not find even 2 places where the dates were exactly the same. For example, some people say that King Saul only ruled for 2 years. Some said 40, some said 42. And even trying to backtrack with figuring out from other events in the Tanakh what happened, this is the best I could come up with. And it's fairly close, maybe off 70 or 80 years, but at least you get the drift. The rich-poor gap really wasn't too much of a problem until after the monarchy came into being. So first we have King Saul, then King David, then King Solomon. And the reason I put the 14th king down here is because of Amos and Micah, who started railing against what was going on at that point in time. And Amos and Micah, by the way, are my favorites. And that is King, and here's the second name I'm going to mess up, King Jeroboam II. So in the early years after Canaan, the family and the tribe was responsible for taking care of its own people. Poverty wasn't really too widespread, and if it was widespread, nobody noticed because everybody pretty much lived near subsistence level. The kings and the governors, no matter how much money they have, they were never mandated anywhere, apparently, either in the Talmud or the Tanakh, to care for the poor. There were, however, plows, hoes, and some metal implements just prior to King Saul, and the farmers, of course, wanted all these new things to make their harvest better. Unfortunately, we know that they had a lot of bad weather. Famine was fairly prevalent. If they had a bad harvest, they usually wound up selling their land, themselves, or their children. Now, I just pulled out a couple of what I thought were the more important points about the kings. King Saul, he was chronically at war with the Philistines, and toward the end of his reign, whenever exactly that was, he was engaged in a civil war with David's followers. He did, however, establish a centralized tax collection, I'll call it an agency, for lack of a better term, and he did establish an army. King David, his reign is usually referred to as the Golden Age. He was, as you know, a warrior engaged in a lot of military campaigns, and during this time there was wide territorial expansion. We're talking from the Mediterranean Sea to the Arabian Desert and the Red Sea to the Euphrates River. He established Jerusalem as the national capital. And very importantly, he was in control at this point after the expansion, in control of the major trade routes. The exports, by the way, were olive oil, wine, perfume, dried sweet fruits, etc. Huge, huge economic growth during this time, not just from trade, but he levied very heavy taxes on the people. And of course, he had the spoils of war, not only all the land and the territory that he won, but the jewels and the money, and just as, if not more important, he garnered some craftsmen and skilled laborers. At this time, the administration of justice was localized to the little districts in the countries or the kingdoms. King Solomon, he managed to maintain the prosperity that started under David, and he increased trade even more by engaging in trade with Tyre, which was, it's part of Phoenicia, if you will. He engaged in this humongous building program, really went wild, and of course he was the one who built the first temple. He was really into this building all over the territories that David had won. Now, unfortunately, or I guess I shouldn't make that judgment, he used forced labor to do this building with. 30,000 men were forced, no choice, to go all over all these countries where he was doing his little building projects. 10,000 a month for a month, and then 2 months off, and then the cycle started over again. So at least 30,000, and that is written in the Tanakh. Now, to get enough money to pay for all of his building and for the temple, he sold land and people. And his taxation on the people was very, very heavy. So the rich-poor gap really widened, and the social strata started to become very evident at this point in time. Now, here we move down to the 14th king. So from here, we're talking about 200 years approximately from Solomon to the time of King Jeroboam in 786 BCE. And we have Amos and subsequently Micah, my favorites, who really railed against the oppression of the poor. If you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and just read this first one just because I like to hear it. Because you impose a tax on the poor and exact from him a levy of grain, you enemies of the righteous, you takers of bribes, you who subvert in the gate the cause of the needy. That's from Amos 5. And another, listen to this, you who devour the needy, annihilating the poor of the land, tilting a dishonest scale and selling grain refuse as grain, buy the poor for silver, the needy for a pair of sandals. I love hearing that, especially when you understand how bad Solomon was treating his people. Now we come to Micah, who was just after Amos. They covet fields and seize them, houses and take them away. They defraud men of their homes and people of their land. And hear this, you chiefs of the house of Israel, who detest justice and make crooked all that is straight, who build Zion with crime, Jerusalem with iniquity. Her rulers judge for gifts, her priest gives rulings for a fee, and her prophets divine for pay. So those are my two favorites. Now, poverty continued and actually worsened after the first temple was destroyed. So how did the poor manage to actually live? In addition to the charity that we've been talking about? Well, we have the working poor and the poor who were unable to work, two essentially different categories. For the working poor, loans without interest. In other words, they were not completely devastated, maybe perhaps giving them a loan, they were in sufficient state to get back up on their feet. Debts for everyone was canceled every 7th year. Maybe you were lucky enough to have relatives who could redeem your land that you probably had to sell if you were that poor. And as we talked about last week, prompt payment of wages. You remember that that all the hired labor had to be paid daily before sunset. Now, if you were poor and unable to work, we talked about the corner of the fields, where you don't reap to the corner of the fields, which, gee, the weeds were the ones that grew in the corner of the fields. And the gleaner laws, which I'll review briefly from last week. The gleaner laws, remember, these were for the poor people. After one pass, everything in the field had to be left there. If you forget a sheaf, you have to leave it there. You can only beat an olive tree once. You gather grapes and not gather them all. And late ripening fruit was left for the poor to pick. We also have the poor man's tithe, which was twice every 7 years, and contractual slavery. One thing that I actually didn't know about this was, forget how we think about slavery, because contractual slavery was completely different. Actually, the Talmud says that a person who acquires a Jewish slave has really acquired a master. And in fact, there were so many laws of protection and how a slave owner was to take care of a contractual slave, and that's someone who had to sell their land because they owed a debt. They had to give the slave the identical food. If the slave owner slept on a fancy bed, you couldn't put the slave on a bed of straw, put him on the floor. He had to sleep on a fancy bed too. You had to give him the same kind of wine that you drank. He got to rest on the Sabbath just like you did, and he wasn't permitted to do any degrading work. You weren't allowed to make him do that. Now we're going to get into some of the communal institutions. I don't know whether we're not scrolling down here or nobody's saying anything. I've just checked the messages. Maybe I'm just boring you to death. Communal institutions. Now the timeline for the emergence of these is debatable, but it's pretty much speculated from my readings that it's somewhere probably around the 3rd century BCE. We have the soup kitchen, the charity fund, the orphan dowry, education, health, and housing. For the soup kitchen, that was for the non-resident poor. They got a loaf of bread every day, fish and vegetables on the Sabbath. If it was a fast day, they got dates after the fast day. Initially, the contributions to this were voluntary and in kind, and after a few years, they had 3 charity wardens who actually went around, and you were still able to give some in-kind donation, but money was also collected. You were eligible for the soup kitchen if you didn't have enough food for 2 meals. The charity fund provided weekly grants to the resident poor, unlike the non-resident poor for the other. Scholars weren't allowed to live in a town that didn't have a charity fund in it. For this, there were 2 charity wardens, and if you had been a resident for 3 months, You had to contribute to this fund. You were eligible to take from this fund if you didn't have enough resources for at least 14 meals. You did have a choice, however, of continuing to try to get some money or food by either begging door to door, what's referred to as a traditional method, or using the communal resources, but you were not allowed to use both. Couldn't find too much on the orphan dowry except that it was there, not too many details. It was probably ad hoc, and I'm going to suspect that it came from the statement from the Tanakh that we are to gladden the bride and the groom. Now, with respect to education, this is one of the most interesting. Actually, the health is the most interesting to me. Education. Torah commands that the Shema be said twice a day and that we have to learn the Torah and teach it. So Torah learning and teaching has been around since about the 1300s BCE, and that's father-to-child teaching, which was common at that time and the only way to get educated. And then in about 460 BCE, Ezra and the Great Assembly mandated that there had to be a public school in Jerusalem for fatherless boys who were 16 years and older. In the last years of the Second Temple period, the high priest Joshua ben Gamla instructed that every town had to have a public school for all 6- and 7-year-old children until they were 18 years old. Now, the community did pay for these schools, and only married men were allowed to be teachers. The teacher-student ratio was very detailed in the Talmud, and boy, does this sound familiar even today. There was to be 25 students per teacher. If there were 50 students, you had to have 2 teachers. And if you had 40 students, you had to have an assistant that was appointed. And one thing that I found very interesting in the same tractate was, if one is inattentive, put him next to a diligent one. I thought that was great. Now, the 6 areas that were taught corresponded with the 6 orders of the Mishnah. Gee, isn't that surprising? Now, obviously, to really get the Mishnah, you also had to have a broader education, and that included, for example, chemistry, agriculture, math, writing, and many more. Now, as the last thing, let me tell you that girls were not taught in the school. Impressed by the level of hierarchical organization in the 3rd century BCE. Boy, so was I. Wait till you hear about health, which is coming up right now. You're not going to believe, remembering that we're talking about over 1,000 years ago, how much they knew in the health arena. Thank you for your comment, by the way. The Israelites recognized a wide spectrum of health disorders: skin diseases, infertility, blindness, and other kinds of eye disorders, deafness, paralysis, mental and blood disorders, and pulmonary infections. Let me just look over here a second. Curious as to whether communal meant grassroots or organized by the government. I'm going to say that I can't answer that specifically, but I'm sure that the government had something to do with it, but it was the local government. And remember that government refers to, in this particular case, it was commanded by the Talmud, as opposed to somebody going around beating and making it come true or become. Excellent question, and I'm going to have to look that up. And I'll leave my email address so that you can email me and tell me you were the one who asked that terrific question. Thank you very much. So we're up to blood disorders and pulmonary infections. Israelites also recognized that animals and insects could carry and transmit disease. This I found fascinating. Circumcision wasn't permitted in families with hemophilia. How did they know that somebody had hemophilia? And marriage to an epileptic or the mentally challenged was forbidden. Treatments included powders, medicated drinks, juices, bandages, compresses, herbs, and insects. Sunlight, bathing, and fresh water was at every meal, and that was definitely recommended. Oil was used to prevent skin cracking because the sun was so intense. Opium was used as an analgesic, and wound debridement to promote wound healing was practiced. Personal and social hygiene regulations were enforced by the priests, if you can believe that, who were the health wardens. Bodily cleanliness leads to spiritual cleanliness was an oft-referenced Talmudic principle. We're talking often referenced. The Talmud also said that the washing of hands and feet in the morning is more effective than any remedy in the world. So there was also a clear awareness of the concept of contagious diseases. Isolation, quarantine, burning or scalding of garments and utensils, scrubbing and smoking out of houses with an infected person was practiced. Family members of a sick person were to be avoided. And during epidemics, people were advised not to gather in crowded alleyways. Food had to be fresh and served on clean dishes. Kissing on the mouth was discouraged, and clothing had to be changed before eating. Now, every town was required to have a physician and a bathhouse, and scholars couldn't reside in a town without them, just like scholars couldn't reside in a town that didn't have a charity fund. You weren't allowed to dig wells near a cemetery or a garbage dump, and it was forbidden to drink uncovered water. Physicians were held in very high esteem, but because they were typically viewed as instruments of God. And since medicine was studied in the Talmudic schools, many Talmud scholars were also physicians. Patients visited the physicians in their home, in the physicians' homes. There weren't any hospitals per se, but there were certain parts of the synagogues that were set aside for the sick. Except for communal physicians who served as legal consultants to the town or to the districts. Physicians were paid by the patients in that case. And most of the physicians, however, were very charitable to the poor and either not charging them or accepting what the patient could afford. As a nursing student, I'm reading from the message here. As a nursing student, the health side is very interesting. Some of the ancient preventative practices are still used today in modern medicine. I'm so glad you said that. I absolutely could not believe how far along they were. I was just awestruck, which is why I had to go into so much detail. I really got hooked on it. Thank you very much for your comment. Glad to see you're as excited as I am, and congratulations for going into a wonderful field. The next thing we're going to talk briefly about, well, I guess nothing I ever do is briefly, is housing. Home hospitality was actually the primary source of shelter for poor travelers until sometime after the emergence of the communal soup kitchen, which we just discussed. The synagogues had rooms in the synagogue complex, not directly in the synagogue, that also served as hostels for poor travelers. In the latter century, the Second Temple period, settlers were needed for the new towns that had been established. You recall all that building. And the prospect of a better life enticed the poor. Sounds like our Old West. By this time, the interurban highways also made travel a lot easier. And the increase in the number of travelers gave rise to pundakot, which are inns that were established along all of the major roads. Typically, these inns were dirty, unpleasant places, and the synagogue hostels were preferred. But the most preferred was still home hospitality, which the wealthy were usually able to afford and were able to obtain. Traveling scholars obviously also preferred home hospitality, and, of course, as encouragement to make sure that the scholars got to stay at someone's home instead of in these dirty places or even in a synagogue. The Talmud says that those who make a scholar welcome in their home and share their possessions with him receive rewards like those who brought the daily sacrifice on the altar in the temple. So let's see if we've covered what we intended to cover. Let's go back up here to the slide. Maimonides' 8 levels of charity. I think we addressed that a bit. Preservation of dignity, brief history and causes of poverty, strategies to contend with poverty, and communal institutions. So does everybody think we kind of addressed most of those? Okay. Next week is the 28th. That's my last week with you, my last night with you for part 3 of the Social Justice series. It also happens to be Yom Yerushalayim. And I'd like to know, I'm going to put my email address up. If you'd like to read together a half Hallel, I'll put both the Hebrew and the English version up on the screen so that we can read it together, and no, I won't have my little head sticking down in the bottom of it. The half Hallel, in case you're not familiar with that, is reading Psalms 113 through 118, omitting the first 11 verses of 115 and 116. There's no bracha with this, and it usually takes about somewhere between 5 and 6 minutes. Now, what time is it? 8:49. Okay. If you don't mind, since I've been so good at counting the Omer, I couldn't do it until after 8:48, and my computer here says it's 8:49, so if you don't mind, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvoto v'tzivanu al sefarat ha'omer. Today is 37 days, which is 5 weeks and 2 days of the Omer. Next week, we're going to look at the 4 major movements in Judaism and how their theological differences affect their social justice emphases and activities. And of course, as we end every program, if you are inclined or able, I'd really like you to consider donating somewhere between $5 and $10 to OneShul. If you can only spare $1, that's $1 that we didn't have. But OneShul, even though we have a lot of volunteers, there are certain things that you can't volunteer for, like we don't run the electric company. We don't run the website. We have to pay for this Ustream so that you can watch us. So any donation would be appreciated. And if you've noticed, the website has changed. So up on the top bar, the donate button is covered in orange. Feel free to click on it, and please donate anything you can. We do run completely on your generosity. I'd like to thank you so much for coming tonight, and I really hope I see you next week. Thank you so much.